My boss claimed my project as his own, then tried to bribe me to stay silent. Hey Reddit, I need to get this off my chest because I honestly don't know who else I could talk to without sounding like a complete lunatic. And I'm still trying to process everything that's happened over the last 3 months at work. Because what started as what I thought would be a normal, challenging, but ultimately rewarding project turned into an absolute nightmare where I found myself staring at the reality that not only was my work stolen, but the very person I trusted the most in that office was willing to manipulate, gaslight, and outright lie to cover it up. And the kicker, the part that still keeps me up at night, is that after all of this, he had the audacity to offer me a bonus to make me stay quiet about the entire ordeal, as if throwing some money at me could erase months of my intellectual labor and emotional investment. I work for a mid-sized tech company in Berlin called Epsilon Innovations, a place that prides itself on being creative, innovative, and collaborative. But over time, I started noticing that the word collaborative seemed to really only apply to certain people who were in the inner circle, which my manager, Lars, was very much the gatekeeper of. And when I got assigned to lead a project to develop a new AI-driven analytics tool that could potentially redefine how our clients made decisions, I honestly felt like I had finally been given a chance to prove myself. Because for months, I had been grinding away late nights, coordinating between departments, and building the architecture from scratch, poring over every line of code, and designing workflows that I knew could change our product lineup forever. It all started innocently enough. I was asked to present the project updates in a small team meeting with Lars and a few executives, and I had prepared everything meticulously, charts, flow diagrams, the whole thing, expecting maybe a few nods, some constructive criticism, and a sense of accomplishment for the work I had put in. But instead, I noticed something subtle at first. Lars was unusually quiet while I presented, nodding at all the right moments, but there was a certain smugness in his eyes. The kind of smugness that makes you feel like someone is enjoying a private joke at your expense, and I chalked it up to my own paranoia, because I wanted to believe the best about people. After all, he had been my boss for over 5 years, and I had always thought we had a decent professional relationship. Over the next few weeks, I began hearing things from colleagues that started to make me uneasy, whispers about a presentation Lars gave to the board that seemed suspiciously familiar to the project I had been working on alone, mentions of features and code structures that only existed in my version, and a feeling that no matter what I said, my input was increasingly being ignored in meetings where my project was supposed to be the centerpiece. As if someone else was slowly erasing my existence from the story of something I had built from nothing, and every time I tried to bring it up, Lars would smile, assure me everything was fine, and even subtly guilt me with comments like, "I know you're stressed, but trust me, this is all for your benefit." Then came the email that absolutely shattered me, the kind of moment where your stomach drops and your hands shake, because the reality finally hits you harder than any suspicion ever could, where I saw the presentation slides uploaded to the board portal with Lars' name on every page, notes that mirrored the exact research and analysis I had spent months preparing, and a final slide that said, and I quote, "Project concept and execution by Lars M. Team collaboration appreciated." Which was the point where I actually had to sit down and breathe, because I couldn't believe the blatant audacity, the complete erasure of my effort, and the calculated brazenness of someone I had respected to not just take credit, but to do it in a way that seemed designed to humiliate me quietly without any witnesses. I spent the next night going through my files, my emails, my drafts and version histories, noting every timestamp, every revision, every moment that proved that I was the creator of the project, meticulous evidence that could back me up if I decided to confront him or go higher up the chain. And yet, the more I documented, the more I realized that I was emotionally exhausted, because it wasn't just about being cheated professionally. It was the sense of betrayal from someone who should have been guiding me, supporting me, and acknowledging my contributions in front of the team, and the slow, creeping fear that maybe at this company, my labor was always going to be someone else's bargaining chip, a commodity to be reshuffled and claimed by those with better political instincts rather than genuine skill or effort. The confrontation was inevitable. I scheduled a meeting with Lars under the pretense of a regular check-in, my laptop open, my evidence organized in a way that made it undeniable, my voice steady but my hands trembling slightly because I knew that once I said the words out loud, there would be no going back. And as I calmly, almost mechanically laid out the timeline of my work, the timestamps, the code commits, and the discrepancies in his presentation versus mine, I watched him lean back in his chair. The kind of lean that people do when they're confident they've caught you in the wrong. And then, after what felt like an eternity, he smiled, that smug, calculated smile that made my blood run cold, and said, "Look, you know I value your work and I don't want this to get messy. I was thinking maybe we could settle this quietly. Here's a bonus, consider it a token of appreciation. Just don't make waves." At that moment, I felt a mix of rage, disbelief, and nausea. The surreal absurdity of being offered money to stay silent about theft, the audacity of reducing months of my creative labor to a few €1,000 with the expectation that I would just nod, smile, and accept. And yet, I also realized something crucial, that this wasn't just about Lars. This was about the culture he represented, the politics of the office that rewarded manipulation over honesty. And that if I didn't take a stand, not only would my work be stolen, but the precedent would be set that anyone could do this and get away with it. And maybe that's when I felt the weight of the responsibility I never asked for. The realization that sometimes in life, standing up for yourself means risking everything you've worked for, including the very job that has paid your rent, kept your lights on, and allowed you to dream about your future. After Lars made his offer, I literally sat in my apartment all night, holding a cup of cold coffee that I barely touched anymore, staring out the window at the city, trying to understand how someone could be so cynical as to steal someone else's work, and then offer a bribe that was supposed to erase all the moral guilt. And deep down I knew that if I agreed, no one would ever know the truth. But then something inside me would break for good, because it wouldn't just be the loss of the project. It would be the loss of myself, my integrity, and the understanding that in a world where everything is so easily sold for money, there are things that can't be valued in euros or dollars. The next day, I came into the office with cold determination, but deep down I felt mixed emotions. Fear, anger, distrust toward everyone who might become an accomplice in this scheme, and at the same time, a desire to prove that justice still exists, even in the corporate hell we call a workplace. My first step was to gather evidence so thoroughly that no one, including Lars himself, could dispute my right to the project. And it turned out to be much harder than I anticipated, because many documents, code, and drafts were distributed across different departments, and access to them was controlled by security systems I didn't even know about until I started digging deeper. Every step reminded me that the stakes in this game were too high, and a mistake could cost me my career, reputation, and peace of mind. Over the course of a week, I secretly copied all the files onto a personal drive, made backups of email correspondence, saved old drafts and commits in the version control system, all while constantly feeling like every move I made could be noticed. Because in the office, like in any other corporate environment, rumors spread faster than news, and colleagues start looking at you suspiciously if they see you're being too cautious. I had to balance between my usual work routine and this covert operation to protect my work, while pretending everything was calm, that the project was progressing as planned, and that I fully trusted Lars, even though every cell in my body was screaming that trust had been betrayed. But the hardest part was the moral tension. I started doubting myself, wondering if I was doing the right thing by acting like a spy at my own job, thinking about what my colleagues might think of my actions if they found out the truth. This feeling of loneliness and internal isolation was almost physically painful, because I realized that an open conflict with Lars could end in dismissal or a career catastrophe, while silence would mean internal death. It was at that moment that I first realized that in corporate politics, there's often no right choice, only a choice between bad and catastrophic, and that sometimes your conscience and your job end up in direct contradiction with each other. Every day, I watched Lars walk around the office with that same smug expression on his face, unaware that I was gathering evidence, and every time he mentioned the project in conversations with other executives, I was literally shaking with internal rage. But I held it together because I understood that an emotional outburst could be used against me. I learned to speak politely, smile, and pretend everything was fine, even though a storm was brewing inside me. I started devising a plan to bring the truth to the company's leadership in a way that no one could accuse me of paranoia or unfounded claims, so that justice could prevail without risking everything I'd built over the years. In between work hours, I started looking for a lawyer and consulting with professionals, realizing that the legal side of the conflict could play a key role if Lars tried to turn the situation in his favor. At the same time, I began documenting the emotional damage, sleepless nights, stress, the feeling of betrayal, all of which I wrote down in a journal, as if preparing for a long battle that could drag on for months. The more I delved into the evidence and strategies, the clearer it became that Lars wasn't just an ordinary clerk who accidentally hijacked my project. He was a master manipulator who studied people like chess pieces and acted solely based on self-interest, without a hint of morality. And then came the moment when Lars first tried to test how vulnerable I was. He approached me in the office and, with that same smile as before, said that if I continue to act too suspiciously, it could negatively affect my reputation and promotion, implying that he knew I was hiding something. That phrase made me realize that we had entered a game where the stakes weren't just high, they were deadly for my future. Every step had to be calculated, and every emotion controlled, because otherwise everything could turn into a catastrophe. I had to take a deep breath, gather my thoughts, and resolve to act as cunningly as my abilities allowed, to finally bring the truth to light. But that same day, another event happened that complicated everything. A colleague from another department, with whom I'd shared some project information, accidentally mentioned details that were supposed to remain confidential. I realized that if the information leaked, Lars could try to twist the situation to make it seem like I was the one who stole his ideas or that I was incompetent. This added extra pressure, because now I had to not only gather evidence and plan a strategy, but also control the entire information flow around the project to avoid any traps Lars might set. It was a game of survival where every mistake could cost not only my career, but also my reputation and even my psychological health. So, caught between the desire to immediately expose him and the fear of losing everything, I started compiling a detailed report with a chronology of events, screenshots of correspondence, links to files and commits, making everything as convincing and documented as possible, so that when I handed it to management, it would be impossible to say it was my personal paranoia. The more I worked on this dossier, the clearer it became that this fight wasn't just for the project. It was a fight for principle, for respect for my labor, and to prevent the corporate world, where everyone tries to outmaneuver each other, from completely devouring me. At the same time, I understood that the outcome could be unpredictable, because Lars was someone who could use any means, including lies and manipulation, to protect his position. The next day, after spending almost the entire night rechecking my dossier, rephrasing every sentence to make it look as objective and convincing as possible, I headed to Lars's office with firm determination to finally end this game where I was a pawn. The feeling of anxiety and tension gripped my chest like iron hands, because I understood. One wrong step, and all those months of preparation could collapse in an instant, leaving me empty-handed and without a reputation. But my inner voice told me that I couldn't stay silent any longer, because if I didn't stand up for myself now, no one in this company would ever believe that an honest person could protect their work. So, I had to act. I climbed the stairs to the fifth floor where Lars's office was, and with each step, I felt adrenaline washing over me in waves, making my heart pound as if it was about to jump out of my chest. At that moment, I realized that fear is just an emotion, but determination and preparation are tools that can turn fear into action. It was this knowledge that gave me the inner strength not to falter when I entered Lars's spacious office, where he sat at his desk with his usual smug smile, as if anticipating my arrival. "You look tense," Lars said, raising an eyebrow and smirking, as if he could read my thoughts. I realized that playing on emotions was his element, but I was already prepared for it because the preparation that had taken me a whole week had paid off. I replied calmly, pretending to be confident in every word. "You know I'm not here to argue, but to show you that I know the truth." His smile didn't fade. It actually grew wider, and in it was genuine surprise mixed with an obvious attempt to assess how dangerous I was. He took a step back, as if trying to distance himself from the threat emanating from my calm tone. Then I pulled out my dossier and placed it on the table, opening it in several places so he could see the chronology of events, screenshots of correspondence, links to commits, and documents that proved my authorship. His eyes first narrowed, then widened as he began to understand that I had really gathered irrefutable evidence. You were going to take this to management?" he asked, his voice cracking. For the first time in history, I felt Lars losing his usual composure. I nodded, calmly replying, "Yes, and not just that. I came here to give you a chance to resolve everything honestly, without unnecessary noise and public proceedings, because I prefer justice over revenge." And at that moment, the first turning point occurred. Lars fell silent for the first time, and a strange silence settled in the office, because up until then, he had always been one step ahead, controlling situations and people using their fear and dependence. Now he was faced with something he couldn't buy or subdue, the truth, which was recorded and documented. This feeling of power that I experienced for the first time was both alarming and liberating, because I understood that now the real game was beginning, where the stakes were higher than ever, and the outcome unpredictable. But Lars wasn't about to give up. His gaze became sharp, tense, and he said slowly, as if carefully choosing each word to strike me psychologically, "You think you have evidence, but no one but the two of us has seen it. Are you sure you can prove this to management?" I felt the tension returning, because playing on trust and manipulations was his element, but I took a deep breath and replied, "I'm sure, and if you think you can intimidate me, you're sorely mistaken." Then Lars stood up, paced the office a few times, then abruptly sat back down and offered me the old deal. "Fine, if you just forget about this, I can give you a bonus. Not too big, but enough for you to turn a blind eye to everything." This offer literally reeked of cynicism, because it tried to turn my honor and labor into a sum of money. But now I understood that the issue wasn't about money. It was about principle. Allowing such a person to go unpunished would be a defeat for my conscience. I put the dossier back in the folder, looked Lars straight in the eyes, and said, "You think you can buy a conscience, but you can't. I'm not agreeing to your offer because it's not about the money. It's about honesty still mattering." At that moment, the office filled with tension, because Lars realized for the first time that his manipulations might fail. I felt something inside me that had been building for months, anger, disappointment, fear, turn into pure determination. I understood that there was no turning back now, because either I would achieve justice or I would lose more than the project. I could lose myself, my faith in an honest world, and my identity. When I left Lars's office, for a moment I felt as if a small wave passed through the corridor, not of wind, but of change. Because up until that point, I had been that quiet tech guy in the corner whom people respected but rarely noticed. Now, with the folder of evidence in hand and a determination that no longer allowed me to step back, I realized I had just disrupted the usual order of things, and how management reacted would determine not only my project, but also how far this domino of lies and appropriations would start rolling through the company. I planned to go straight to HR and the internal control department, because that was civilized and formal, but before I could reach the reception desk, my inbox filled with a notification about an urgent meeting with our product director, a woman named Katerina, whose name always evoked stern respect in me, because she possessed that rare mix of intelligence and uncompromising nature that was valued in our company almost like a religious attribute. The meeting was scheduled in 2 hours, and the invitation stated that the discussion concerned strategy and redistribution of resources for key initiatives, which, translated into human language, meant either someone had decided to publicly rewrite the script, or someone had already started laying down a new line of defense. I arrived at the meeting and sat by the wall, watching as the room gradually filled. Senior managers with their usual masks of politeness, a couple of board members, Lars, who seemed to be trying to look completely calm, though his gaze flickered with that same tense, spark-eyed scene when he first realized I was prepared, and Katerina, who entered last, holding a tablet and papers. From her composure, it was clear that she already knew something or wanted to know, and that gave me a bit of hope, because if a leader at that level didn't know, the whole system would be completely flawed, and I wasn't ready to fight absolute indifference from above. The meeting started politely and professionally, like all meetings in large companies, with phrases like feedback, process improvement, synergies, and I endured, listening to the generalities, already starting to understand that someone at the top was trying to frame these discussions in a way that allowed them to wash their hands cleanly. But after half an hour, Katerina suddenly changed her tone and said directly, "Lars, please tell us about the initiative you presented to the board last week." Her voice held not just professional interest but a wary demand. Then Lars stood up and gave a presentation, brilliant, convincing, with numbers, charts, strategic maps, and that same set of jargon that always covers emptiness. But more importantly, he spoke like someone who knew not just the content but how to hold an audience, how to restructure meaning. Midway through his speech, I saw the faces in the room change, from neutral to admiring, because he skillfully shifted emphases, seasoned everything with beautiful promises, and effortlessly earned approval. When Lars sat down, an applause-like politeness hung in the air, and Katerina looked at me, inviting me to share my opinion. Inside, everything tightened because I realized I had a chance right now, in front of everyone, to say that phrase which would either become an act of justice or destroy me. I gathered my courage and stood up to lay out the facts, not emotions, because emotions in such a room were easily seen as weakness, and I wanted it to be strictly documented and without unnecessary embellishments. I covered the chronology, talked about commits, versions, emails, and how the ideas that sounded in Lars's presentation were mine, and that the code, architecture, and design elements were all created by me. I turned to Katerina with a request to conduct an internal review and consider proper attribution of the work. And then something happened that I didn't expect. First, a short pause, and I saw Lars trying to hold it together. Then someone from the legal department stood up and said in a calm, concrete voice that any claims to intellectual property require a formal request and legal procedure, and that until that's done, it's extremely difficult to publicly halt or reverse a decision. It was clear that his words weren't just concern for order. They were a concrete wall built to prevent unreliable questions from reaching the board of directors on a regular basis. For a second, I felt my evidence becoming fragile in the face of this bureaucratic monster. Katerina smiled, not a kind smile but a professional one, and said she would definitely appoint an internal investigation and temporarily postpone the project decision. I thought, there it is, justice. But while I was rejoicing in that word, Lars leaned in and quietly said, "I'm ready to provide all materials and cooperate with your review." In his voice slipped a delicate note I hadn't noticed before, a challenge, as if he was throwing down the gauntlet. Check it. You'll see that the contribution was team-based. And that phrase, team contribution, sounded to me like an attempt to blur the traces of stolen authorship. A few days later, the formal investigation began. An internal matter with a 30-day deadline, working groups formed including representatives from legal, IT security, HR, and, to my surprise and delight, an independent external consultant invited for objectivity. This gave me a small reason to believe the game was being played fairly. But then came steps that at least confused me. Lars still remained in his position as leader over part of the team, and some employees I thought I was on good terms with suddenly stepped aside, reacting to the situation cautiously, as if someone had hung a "Do Not Interfere" sign over it all. I felt loneliness creeping in again. The first thing I noticed was subtle attempts at discreditation, rumors about my emotional instability, hints that I might have jumped to conclusions hastily, and once someone even brought up my history with the team, reminding that in the corporate world, authorship is often redistributed, and you need to know how to play by the rules or deals fall apart. I saw people I'd shared lunches and ideas with now looking at me with caution, like a taboo subject, and it deeply wounded me because it felt like in corporate culture, loyalty is valued not by truth but by politics and benefits. Parallel to this, I started receiving uneasy messages from colleagues. Some wrote privately expressing support but asked to keep them secret. Others openly refused to help, citing fear of losing their jobs, and even HR, which I thought was on my side, quickly started talking about neutrality, processes, and the temporary need not to add fuel to the fire, which in fact meant pretending nothing extraordinary was happening until all sides got tired and dispersed. Meanwhile, Lars continued doing what he does best. He confided in upper management, emphasizing his strategic role, showing results that hadn't been fully verified yet, and in the process skillfully disseminating those theses about teamwork and lack of transparency in the development process. I saw how part of the board, especially those focused on quick results and seeing Lars as someone who brings in clients, leaned toward listening to his version, because money and quarterly metrics were at stake, and when financial metrics come into play, justice is often put on hold. One night, I decided I couldn't wait any longer, and that if the system confidently spun the wheels of bureaucracy, everything I'd done could crumble. So, I wrote an anonymous letter to the compliance department, attaching part of the evidence and a brief description of the circumstances, betting that an external review and the risk to the company's reputation would force the board to act faster. Though it was risky, anonymity could be traced, and an anonymous message could be dismissed as malicious insinuation. I believed it was a lever that could move things off dead center. The reaction was stormy and lightning fast. Compliance started accelerated checks, external auditors requested access to all code and financial logs, and this was the moment when I first felt the truth starting to gain weight. Because if the external audit confirmed my version, it wouldn't just be word against word. It would be a documented exposure that couldn't be brushed off. But along with this came the retaliation. Someone from legal suddenly became interested in my employment contracts, checking if there were clauses I might have violated. HR started asking questions about my overtime nights and personal resilience, and one day I was handed a notice of temporary suspension from work for the duration of the investigation, a formal measure supposedly aimed at ensuring impartiality in the investigation. But to me, it looked like punishment, an attempt to silence me, to exclude me from the corporate field, while Lars continued leading presentations and interacting with clients. I left the office that day with a heaviness that's impossible to describe, because I felt both ashamed and bitter. Ashamed that I was removed from the process with the words temporarily suspended, and bitter that truth requires you to pay a price for it, and that price is your normal life, your job, your daily rhythm. I sat at home, flipping through the folder of evidence, pondering how far I'd go and what else I was willing to lose to prevent this injustice from becoming the norm. The day after the official suspension, I woke up with a heaviness in my chest that didn't let go for a minute, because I realized that now every little thing, every electronic record, and every word of mine could become decisive evidence or a weapon against me. I decided I had no right to waste time, so I opened my laptop and started meticulously reviewing all my old commits, design versions, colleague correspondences, and internal reports that had once seemed routine and just part of the work process. Now every file had turned into a potential shield for my righteousness, but also a source of danger if someone from outside tried to extract context and distort it. I understood that Lars had already started his quiet campaign. He skillfully spoke with the same colleagues who had supported me yesterday, explaining that it was all teamwork and that some points might be controversial. It sounded like an innocent phrase, but to me, it rang like an alarm signal, because when it comes to corporate politics, words can easily turn into legal grounds for absolving responsibility. I felt the game turning into chess, where the pieces change daily and the rules are rewritten on the fly. That same day, the external auditor arrived at the office, and I arranged a meeting with him through my channels. A person with an iron reputation who didn't take anyone's word on faith but worked solely with evidence and logs. When we sat together, I detailed how Lars had appropriated my work, showed emails, code versions, documented every step of the process. I saw his eyes narrow as he evaluated the evidence, and for the first time I felt a weak but real taste of hope. If his review confirmed my words, the matter wouldn't just be verbal. It would gain legal and documentary force. But this hope went hand in hand with continuous internal stress. Colleagues started whispering quietly. Some openly avoided eye contact. Others sent Slack messages like, "Hang in there, we're on your side," but covertly because they feared open involvement could ruin their careers. I realized that this fight for justice wasn't just against Lars, but against the entire corporate system that was used to hushing up such situations, maintaining an external, positive atmosphere, and ignoring how talent gets lost or appropriated. One evening, as I was about to head home, one of the senior developers I'd been friends with for several years messaged me. "Listen, there's one way to speed everything up, but it's risky. Are you ready?" My heart raced because I understood. From here on, I'd have to make decisions that could destroy not only my career, but also relationships with people I considered friends. He continued, "I can share what Lars is doing in real time on the server, access to logs, code changes, hidden commits. But if they trace it back to you, it'll be serious. Are you really ready for that risk?" I thought about it and realized, yes, I was ready, because otherwise all these months of preparation and fighting the system would be in vain, and if the truth wasn't proven, it would disappear in the bureaucratic thicket, and my name would be sidelined as if I'd never existed. Then the sense of justice would finally turn into an illusion. I agreed, and we arranged a precise action plan, step by step to minimize risks, but each step was a nerve-wracking game with fire. I felt the stress starting to affect me physically. Sleepless nights, trembling hands, the sensation that every breath could cause a mistake. A week later, Lars started noticing oddities. Someone was monitoring the server, someone was doing unexpected checks, and his confidence began to waver. Internal conversations that had previously been invisible to me now became audible through indirect leaks, and I understood. The game was gaining momentum, and now the risk wasn't just in proving authorship but also in not being accused of sabotage, because the system could easily rewrite facts in his favor, and my evidence was a thin thread that could be snapped with one wrong move. In my personal life, the situation also heated up. Friends I considered support started cautiously keeping their distance, family didn't understand the details, and my parents began joking that the corporate world is cruel. Those words, though said with a smile, hit my nerves because no one saw the full depth of the struggle happening in the office every day. I had to hide my emotions, pretending to be calm when inside boiled a mix of fear, anger, and an irreconcilable desire to prove the truth. And then came the day when the external auditor sent his first report. Facts, dates, logs, emails, code changes, all matched my documentation. Everything pointed to the appropriation being blatant. Now the decision lay with the board of directors. But Lars, being a master manipulator, had already prepared a plan. Offer me a bonus for silence, try to strike a deal. For the first time, I found myself at a moral crossroads. Agree, get the money and the chance to leave quietly, or fight to the end, risking my career, reputation, and psychological health. I looked at that letter, the numbers, the external auditor's recommendations, and understood that if I took the bonus, I'd essentially acknowledge his actions, though verbally I could justify it as compensation for moral damage. But that would betray what I considered justice, and then my entire internal compass would break. Because in a world where every step is controlled and every document can be used as a weapon, a moral victory is worth more than any money, but it requires incredible resilience. That evening, I wrote in my journal, I can sell my silence for money or risk everything for the truth. Each decision shapes not only my future but also corporate ethics, and if I bend, tomorrow no one will say the word honesty without a smile and an empty formula. That's heavier than any fine or threat of dismissal. And at that moment, I understood that the next week would be defining. Either I'd force the system to acknowledge my work and restore justice, or Lars would win. And with him, all the invisible, quiet corruption that turns talent into a commodity and efforts into formalities. Then everything I considered an achievement would prove empty. When the day of the meeting with the board of directors arrived, I felt both prepared and utterly vulnerable, because I understood. Now everything depended not only on the documents and logs I'd gathered for months, but also on how I could keep myself together, how convincingly I could tell about my work, that the project was entirely mine, how Lars had appropriated the results of my labor, and at the same time maintain a moral face, because even the slightest display of aggression, anger, or despair could be used against me. I entered the boardroom where the members were already gathered. Lars sat across from me with a smirk that was supposed to look confident, but I saw through it to the tension. Every glance he threw my way seemed like an attempt to read my thoughts, anticipate my strategy. At that moment, I realized this wasn't just a business meeting. It was a chess game where every phrase mattered, and losing cost not only a career but also reputation. The board started with formalities, discussing current projects, reports, and metrics. But when my turn came, I carefully laid out the documents, showing every commit, every correspondence, and every email where my authorship was fixed, every table, every graphic representation where it was clear that my work had brought the project to the stage now used by Lars. I told everything as calmly as possible, in detail, without emotions, because I knew, the less I let feelings control me, the stronger the effect would be. The board members began studying the papers attentively, occasionally asking clarifying questions that only confirmed the story looked irrefutable. When Lars started interrupting me with attempts to justify his actions with words like, "This was teamwork," or "We all contributed," I simply raised my gaze, noted every gesture, every vague explanation, and responded with specific facts, showing the chronology of events, dates, and evidence that couldn't be refuted. At that moment, I felt power starting to shift to me, because truth was on my side, and Lars's lies were becoming transparent and vulnerable like glass. After an hour of discussions and interrogations, the board invited us to a closed session where Lars tried to negotiate behind the scenes, offering me compensation and silence. But I already knew that an agreement would mean not only betraying my principles, but also allowing such cases to become the norm for the company. I said directly, "I'm not interested in bonuses or silence. I want everything to be publicly acknowledged, because only then does corporate ethics make sense. My statement threw Lars into confusion, because he expected me to give in under pressure. The meeting ended with official recognition of my authorship and an award of compensation for moral damage. But the most important thing for me was the moment when the board stated the need to review internal procedures so that such appropriations wouldn't happen again. At that moment, I felt I'd won not just a case against one person, but a small battle for justice in a system where power and manipulation usually prevail. But the joy was mixed with fatigue and moral cost. I lost trust in colleagues who had seemed like friends. I realized the corporate world is much harsher than I thought, and that every success comes at a price. Sometimes not just time and effort, but psychological stress and doubts in one's own principles. When I left the building, I felt both relief and emptiness, because the win gave freedom and recognition, but it required an internal sacrifice. At home, I sat alone for a long time, rereading notes, recalling moments when I almost gave up, when I thought I'd have to agree to compensation for silence. I realized this story had become not just a business case but a personal lesson. Sometimes true victory lies not in money and status, but in the ability to stay true to yourself, even when the system tries to break you, and even when the whole world offers an easy and convenient but immoral path. I wrote the last note about the project in my journal. Today I won not only the case but also faith that honesty matters. Lars got compensation for his own mistakes, and I got peace that can't be measured in money. But the price is high. Trust in the world is forever changed, and every step now requires caution because I know truth is rare and lies are habit. At that moment, I first felt the struggle was over, though the lessons would stay with me for life. After the board of directors officially recognized my authorship and issued a decision on compensation, life seemed to turn to a new chapter. But the feelings of victory were mixed with fatigue and nervous tension, because I understood, even when the system officially vindicates you, its shadows remain, and trust in colleagues and the world after such trials will never be the same. The next day I came into the office, and the atmosphere was strange. Many employees looked at me differently, some with respect, some with envy, some with clear distrust, since everyone knew I'd exposed Lars and insisted on public recognition of my merits. Though I felt satisfaction, the understanding that now I'd be evaluated not only by my work, but also by this battle gave a strange sense of vulnerability, as if I'd become a symbol on which everyone now tested their own ambitions and fears. Lars no longer tried to hide anything, but his presence in the office now reminded of failure. He worked quietly, without his usual self-assured smirk, and every step seemed cautious, as if he himself feared a new exposure. In turn, I realized revenge wasn't my goal, and observing his changes, I felt a strange satisfaction, because justice, though harsh, had been restored without personal aggression. The project that caused this whole story started yielding results, and I noticed people now turning to me for advice, listening to my opinion, and the company became more transparent in matters of authorship and merit distribution. Because after the Lars case, the board realized that neglecting employee rights leads to moral and reputational catastrophe. This small step became a personal victory for me, not only as a professional, but also as a person who managed to stand up for justice in a world where honesty is often a rarity. Personally for me, the consequences were more complex than just professional wins. I started valuing people who stay by your side without hidden motives more, stopped trusting those who easily succumb to greed or fear, and understood that in any organization, it's important not only what you do but how you preserve internal integrity. Because once you lose self-respect, it's impossible to regain true self-worth. Friends who previously thought me too soft and yielding now looked at me with new respect, and I, in turn, understood that sometimes rigidity and principledness aren't aggression, but defense of one's moral boundaries. I remembered this lesson forever, because the price of compromises with injustice turns out to be too high. Despite all this, my personal life suffered. I had to reevaluate my circle of acquaintances, relationships with colleagues and loved ones, because disappointment in people who had seemed friends was a heavy burden. I began valuing the few who supported me unconditionally, who believed in my truth even when everyone around tried to deny it. In the end, I understood that true victory isn't in money or recognition. It's in the ability to stay true to yourself and your principles, even when the system and people around try to break you. It was this sense of internal honesty that gave me peace that can't be bought with any bonuses, premiums, or praises. I wrote the final lines in my journal. Today I didn't just win the project and restore justice. I proved to myself that honesty and principledness are stronger than fear and pressure, and that a person's true value isn't in status or money, but in the ability to remain yourself, even when the whole world is against you. For the first time in a long time, I felt a lightness that comes after a heavy trial, when you know you did everything right, despite the price and consequences.